The Commission on Community Placemaking and Prosperity has been spending the last year hearing from experts and inspiring community groups themselves from up and down the country, learning what they feel they need from the government to turn around their places and really deliver on the levelling up agenda. And the message we've got back time and time again is that levelling up our left behind places must mean investing in both the physical fabric of local place and the social fabric of local communities, and that we have to trust local communities to lead that process themselves. Left behind places are not just products of economic decline or income inequality. The sad fact is that far too many places feel left behind, also as a legacy of post-war urban design, poor planning, centralised decision making, and decades of underinvestment in the social infrastructure that is so vital to local community life. So we need the levelling up agenda to focus less on expensive heavy infrastructure and more on the sort of fine-grained community-led regeneration that we know works really well. Neighbourhoods should normally come first, and government funding should be as much about empowering as imposing any sort of idea of national levelling up. We've made a series of policy proposals for government grouped under 5 key themes. The first is that places really matter. Left behind places need trees, trams and tricycles to create prosperous, child-friendly places. Because the quality of local environments really matters to people. High quality urban places are not just a luxury for the affluent, they make us all healthier, happier and more prosperous. And the sad truth is that many of our towns and suburbs need to go on a road diet. We need to replace dual carriageways that ruin town centres and sever communities with tree-lined boulevards, high quality public spaces and ultimately with new tram lines. We use the tricycle test as a way of thinking about this. If you're changing a place, would you make it more likely for a small child to be able to poodle around happily on a tricycle? If so, it's almost certainly a good place to hang out, to go shopping, to access services. It's going to be serving its local community well. Sadly, far too many of our left behind places fail the simple tricycle test now. Secondly, trees. Planting street trees is simply one of the best and most effective ways to make places better now. We know that we can do this. The government has already started a fantastic national initiative to plant more street trees around the country. We need to put rocket boosters under that and ensure that all our left behind places really can increase the number of trees in their local areas. We also know that street greening and greening local places is a fantastic way to engage and empower local communities and get them empowered and involved in changing their local place for the better. Finally, we know that lots of local left behind places really suffer from poor connectivity. Transport infrastructure is far too heavily predicated on connecting very large cities with each other and enabling commuter flows at peak hours. We need a revolution in local transport so that people can get around towns, suburbs, our cities and villages between local places easily at different times of the day, reflecting the emerging patterns of work and care and leisure and travel. And that means a massive investment in better buses and new generations of trams. Tram lines used to be the absolute lifeblood of a lot of our towns and smaller cities, and unfortunately during the 20th century a lot of those were ripped out. Happily, new technology and regulatory reform now offers the opportunity to create new trams at vastly lower costs. So we want to see a new revolution in tram lines and bus networks for the 21st century. Our second key theme is high streets and town centres, because town and neighbourhood centres really are vital for both prosperous community life and the self-identity of places. Left behind towns now need the tools to remake the high street as a heart of community life once again. Unfortunately, decades of economic change and now the severe impacts of the COVID pandemic have left the traditional high street on a knife edge, and it must reinvent itself or face terminal decline. Firstly, we think that government has an urgent job to do in protecting the independent high street businesses that give places their distinctive character and particularly make high streets the interesting places that they can be. They need to be protected from a tsunami of post-pandemic debt which threatens to engulf them. The government has done a great job in providing bounce-back loans to get them through the pandemic. Unfortunately, those loans are now going to weigh down on those businesses and could threaten to send huge numbers of them into bankruptcy. We think there's a sufficiently strong case to turn those £1.7 billion of those bounce-back loans to the small independent high street sector into grant to keep those businesses viable for the long term. Secondly, we're already seeing a wave of retail closures on the high street, resulting in a lot of empty property. That threatens to blight regeneration and to act as a drag on community revival on the high street and town centres for decades to come, unless we do something about it. We think there's a strong case for government to provide funding to a revolving asset fund that can buy up vacant shops and get them back into beneficial use as quickly as possible. Thirdly, we want to build on the success of the business improvement district model by creating a new wave of community improvement districts. These will be voted for by local communities and businesses, but including a wider group of stakeholders such as housing associations, local authorities, other public bodies, as well as local residents themselves, to convert town centres back into thriving, diverse hubs of community, cultural and commercial life once again. Our third key theme is social infrastructure and community-led regeneration. Social infrastructure is absolutely essential for healthy community life, but sadly people in left behind places report that what their areas often lack are precisely those places for people to meet, the basic social facilities like community centres, libraries and pubs that allow communities to come together. Sadly, the incentives on property owners and the ability of often public authorities to keep such facilities open have actually declined in recent years, such that we can find properties being left empty, services closed and the neglect of heritage buildings. At its worst, we've found cases of what we've termed the farming of neglect, where private owners leave key high street and town centre buildings vacant, often for decades on end, while trading them and submitting repeated planning applications in order to inflate property values and actually extract value from those places, all the while leaving key assets empty and blighting left behind communities. We need to tackle the farming of dereliction, and we need to really empower communities to be at the forefront of that movement. Now, the government recognised these issues and actually consulted on creating a community right to buy back in 2010. But sadly, they bottled it, and in the 2011 Localism Act created only a community right to bid. This gives communities the right to register assets of community value, and tens of thousands have since been registered. But then when those assets come up for sale on the market at the owner's behest, unfortunately communities are only given the right to offer the owner money for them. Far too often that means that the owners simply choose not to sell, or sell to a higher bidder, or just to sell to a different bidder because they can. We need to reverse that decision and really create a genuine community right to buy, so that communities themselves have the first dibs on property when it comes up for sale in those critical locations. Secondly, we need to go a bit further and tackle the farming of dereliction by using the proposed new right to regenerate to ensure that communities can actually buy empty or vacant property that has been neglected in their town centres for far too long. And that right has to apply both to private and to public property, or it will simply be toothless. It will cut no mustard with left behind communities to be told that they have to accept dereliction and vacant property on their high street simply because the right to regenerate only applies to local authority owned land, not to privately owned property too. Our fourth theme is around homes and residential neighbourhoods, because left behind neighbourhoods are going to need street by street investment to bring homes up to standard. We heard time and again from left behind communities about the problems caused by often an ageing and rather poor quality housing stock, which is both degrading the value of the neighbourhood, making it expensive and difficult for people to heat their homes adequately, and ultimately fueling a downward spiral of degeneration in some places. Worst of all, this is then often exploited by some buy-to-let landowners who see the opportunity to acquire properties and let them out at housing benefit rates, adding to the sense of population churn and dislocation in a lot of left behind places. We think that when you add the huge challenge of meeting the nation's net zero carbon target by 2050, that there's only one solution to this problem, and that is simply for major investment on an area-wide basis to improve the quality of the existing housing stock, starting with our most left behind communities. It's only that sort of street by street, area-wide investment, not leaving it to individual owners, not waiting for landlords to decide to invest in their individual properties, but doing it on a street by street basis that can not only deliver the scale of the improvements we need, but also improve the value and the quality of local neighbourhoods and start to recoup some of the cost of that investment made in the first place. We think to kickstart the process, the government needs to work with the social housing sector and bring forward the social housing decarbonisation fund that has been promised, because that money, working with landlords who already have a large stock that they need to upgrade, is what will enable the supply chains to be kick-started that we're going to need for all the technology, investments, skills and capacities to upgrade the entire nation's housing stock by 2050. We think we can do that through a new generation of neighbourhood improvement districts. Thirdly, we're going to need new homes in some places, as well as improving the quality of the existing homes. We heard from numerous local communities where either housing associations, local councils themselves, or community-led regeneration organisations were building affordable housing in their neighbourhoods designed by and for local people. We know that these models can be fantastic at turning around the fortunes of left behind places, and we need government to be supporting them much more proactively than they have been to date. The final theme is around the institutions and investment needed to deliver sustainable regeneration at a local level. Because levelling up the country really needs government to trust communities more with flexible long-term funding, and to recognise that the value of a rich local infrastructure and an ecosystem of different types of organisation all collaborating locally. Far too often, national funding streams are narrowly focused on achieving value for money to deliver a particular service. There are good reasons for that mindset, but it ultimately works against delivering that kind of dense, rich network of different kind of institutions working locally to improve lives that we know really make the difference. Successful places don't just have one public service body or one private employer. They have a rich and successful ecosystem, and we need government funding streams to recognise the value of multiple institutions. Particularly, we need government to recognise the value of anchor institutions. These are those particular bodies in local places that can have a catalytic and kind of central value for that local community above and beyond their individual service that institution may provide. We've heard time and again from local communities how it was the closure of that anchor institution, whether it was the further education college or a healthcare facility or a large private employer, that was the death knell for that community. So we need government to recognise the additional value that those anchor institutions have in places in their funding decisions, particularly when difficult decisions are being made to close institutions. Closing the last public service in a neighbourhood really should be different from closing just one of them. Secondly, we need government to liberate local councils from the burden of debt that they have accumulated in recent years. We know that local authorities are capable of investing intelligently and wisely in their local neighbourhoods. Unfortunately, many of them are now carrying a large burden of debt. However, the combination of the pandemic, the massive challenge of reaching net zero, and the fact of near zero interest rates, we think is sufficiently extreme to justify a single one-off generational transfer of that local government debt onto the national balance sheet, which ultimately should even save the nation money, as central government balance sheets attract even lower interest rates than local government debt does. Thirdly, we need government to recognise that all public spending decisions have an impact on the quality of local services and the quality of local life. And we therefore welcome Danny Kruger's call for a concept of social value to be baked into all public funding decisions. We have to get away from this idea of simply funding in narrow silos based on a crude calculation of benefit to cost ratio for that individual service or investment. We need to think more broadly about how public intervention and public investment supports the social value of local places. And finally, we know from the huge success of the Big Local programme around the country that the best way to really get local communities in the most left behind places animated and engaged in improving lives locally is to trust them with relatively small amounts of money. That's been the message of the Big Local programme, and we now need government to scale that up with a £2 billion community wealth fund that will give local communities in the most left behind places the opportunity to develop their own solutions free from government restrictions on exactly what they should be doing. We know that local places often know best what is needed. We need to trust them a bit more with a little bit of money to get things going and see what improvements they can make to their local communities. Thank you.